Hey, I usually don't enjoy doing what ifs like this one because it feels too interpretive to how we got here in the first place, because even though Dawn played a fake immunity statue in this episode, it was just that, a fake statue. We have no reason to believe that Dawn was close to finding the real statue, so to me, this what if is adjacent to something like what if Brick found the statue, what if Joe found the statue. We never saw these people go looking for the statue, or even know the location of the statue to say they were ever remotely close to it. But I decided to still do this what if for a couple reasons. First, a lot of people have recommended this what if to me, and that's rarely a reason I'll do a what if that I don't really like, but considering I'm trying to lessen my workload as of late, doing a what if I'm not super invested in will be nice, as I don't have a lot of faith in this as an idea anyway, so I don't have to stress too much about the results of what happens or the writing. I can just kind of take this as an easy trial mode. This will be a what if that isn't too heavy, and people already want to see it, and that feels like a good time to be writing for it. Secondly, as much as people shit on Scott's weird pre-merge strategy this season of like throwing his team's challenges so there's more people eliminated on his team and the other team goes into a false insecurity, he is super well positioned on his original team. He is almost like a mob boss of how easily he works everyone to get where he wants. Thus, there aren't many realities to me where Scott could be an early boot because he is in such a strong power position on his team, and the idea of him leaving early for this what if is very interesting to me. Also, mini add-on point for this is that I've done a what if where Dawn stayed in it for longer, but I think it will be interesting to write for Dawn having to smash this perception of her being a thief, because usually Dawn isn't hated as, well, she's a very nice person. So to see her still have to deal with the effects of Scott's ruining her reputation sounds fun. And lastly, the strongest reason I am doing this what if is that I can still envision a way to make this at least decently possible to happen. Technically, the change I'm actually making this what if is what if Scott never got attacked by Fang in the second episode, because Scott getting attacked by Fang is what led to Scott having his shark tooth, and the shark tooth is what he used to carve the fake statue that Dawn ended up finding. So now in a world where Scott never carved a fake for Dawn to find, Dawn would have more reason to thoroughly look for the statue because she doesn't think she has a real one. Especially with Scott's public outing of her as a thief, she would know for sure that she is going to be eliminated. That's even still a bit iffy to me, as we don't know where the statue was hidden and if Dawn could reasonably get there in time, but I do think it's fair enough given that Dawn has an extreme advantage looking for the statue because of her ability to whisper of animals. I don't think she can reasonably pacify every scene with her animal whispering, but it definitely would make it a lot easier for her to explore, and I could even see birds and fireflies leading a path to the statue for Dawn, since they build a connection with her and don't want to see her go. For this first episode, there isn't much to talk about, as obviously with Dawn using the statue to save herself, Scott gets eliminated from Dawn's sole vote. The team, without saying, would be floored, and Scott would have a complete meltdown at Dawn foiling his hard work. She would grin at him and wave him goodbye as Chef pulls Scott into the catapult. The rats would look on at Dawn in judgment as they are still mad for her stealing, and her taunting Scott on his way out doesn't help with this perception. The mutant maggots would still have their bathroom scene of the girls doing their hair in extremes of each other. The male rats would be talking in the boys' cabin about creating a men's alliance to vote out Dawn, as they still think of her as the thief, especially Brick, who would be laying out the plan to the boys. They would hear a knock on the door. As Lightning creaks the door open, he sees Dawn as she greets her team a good morning and asks if they could talk so she can explain herself. Lightning glares at her, telling her that she's lucky his baby is still intact, otherwise she wouldn't be. Sam giggles from inside the cabin, asking if he called protein powder in his baby. Lightning slams the door in front of Dawn as he's heard chasing Sam. Dawn has a confessional upset that she has to apologize to everyone for saving them from the traitor known as Scott, unsure about how she can fix her reputation. Brick breaks up the two boys before Lightning attacks Sam, insisting they focus as they all have to agree to vote out Dawn next to make sure she goes home. Brick sticks his hand in the middle, waiting for him to follow. Lightning does, and Sam follows suit, but they both pull away when they see Sam's thumb knot, and the same scene of Sam explaining it's from gaming and attempting to show off his skills still happens. Before the challenge begins, the maggots see Dawn, and namely Anne-Marie and Joe are very upset that she isn't eliminated for being a thief. Brick angrily informs them that they are just as surprised, telling them that Dawn played the invincibility statue last night. Anne-Marie takes a jab at Dawn, saying she wonders who she stole the statue from. Chris explains the challenge as both teams go exploring for animals to dress up. Dawn, being an animal whisperer, would be able to help with this significantly as she comes back to her team of 3 intensely mutated creatures she befriended. But Brick, not knowing how to put human clothes on the creatures, and also not wanting to work with Dawn, rejects the animals, making sure to be gentle, just saying he doesn't want to interfere with their natural beauty. The animals hang their heads in shame and walk away. Brick reveals his plan to use the Yeti since it's in the form of a tall hairy human, so it'll be easier to dress. Sam asks how he plans on dressing the Sasquatch when Brick shows the same exploding duffel bag from the original he plans on using. Dawn would protest heavily at the idea of throwing an exploding bag at the innocent creature. Lemming points out that innocent creature could kick the rest of them through a field goal. Lemming strokes his chin as he thinks about how good of a football player the Sasquatch would make, quickly agreeing with Dawn to not hurt it for that reason. Brick attempts to calm them down, saying the duffel bag won't hurt the Sasquatch at all. Dawn continues, saying it will still be quite emotionally scarring to him, that an occupant of Mother Earth must be so lonely out here, and it would be cruel. She could just go talk to him himself and get him to willingly dress up for them. Brick rejects the idea, saying he already made the bag and the Sasquatch can probably smell the thievery on her. Dawn gulps and looks away, deciding to not further isolate herself from the team, and agrees to the plan. Brick has a confessional explaining that he refuses to accept the help of a treacherous person to his team's first run on the rats. He talks about a belief he grew in the cadet training that if your first team's win is done unhonorably, then the team is cursed to never win again. And he knows he might look cruel being so harsh with Dawn, but he's encountered his share of bad people and there are always the ones you least expect. Telling the camera to trust him, he's been beaten up by a girl half of Dawn's size. Brick stutters to explain to the camera that it was under very specific circumstances and it didn't last any longer than 3 months. Because she moved schools. Sam would still look in the duffel bag, insisting the clothes are not made for a fashion show, and go to talk to Dakota to get fashion advice. The maggots would still enter their maggot into the fashion rock, getting a favorable score. The rats would enter their enraged Yeti wearing stripes and not do well. When the paparazzi takes photos of the Yeti making him more embarrassed, Dawn would try to stand in front of it to shield her from the photos, but the Yeti would still be angry and rip off the clothes while kidnapping Lindsay. The challenge would still be switched to rafting to Boney Island to save Lindsay. Zoe would find time to talk with Dawn, as she stays near the back of the team due to being outcasted. Dawn, that is, not Zoe. Zoe has a confessional, not enjoying all the attacks on Dawn, as she knows what it's like to be bullied and it's not fun. Besides, Dawn told her something about Mag yesterday, and she can't get it off her mind, so she has to follow up. Zoe asks Dawn how she's holding up, and Dawn admits it's been hard lately and no one on her team trusts her. Dawn desperately faces Zoe, insisting that she must trust Dawn though, and she is innocent. Zoe is a bit surprised seeing Dawn so vulnerable, and Zoe says that she seems alright, maybe some travels with a pack of wolves and Salem Town vibes, but besides that, alright. However, to have her full trust, there shouldn't be any secrets between them, so Zoe asked what Dawn meant about Mike yesterday when she said the Mike parts like her. Dawn grimaces at the prying, knowing she can't reveal Mike's secret, and just walks away from Zoe, telling her it's not her place to say. The cast would arrive at the foot of the Yeti's rock hill, and Brick would throw another duffel bag at the Sasquatch, making him mad, and stomp the ground, setting up the planks like Donkey Kong. Lemming would still create the plan for 3 people to climb up the structure at the same time. Brick would agree with the plan as he turns to Sam, asking if he's ready, but he sees him lying on the ground hallucinating about video games. Dawn raises her hand to ask if she could take his place, and Brick reluctantly agrees as the 3 scale the structure. The Sasquatch, like the original, would quickly destroy the rats by quickly throwing barrels at them. I struggle knowing if you could hit Dawn, as Dawn is small and regarded generally as quick, even though we never see it happen on screen. It's a tough call for me, but I decided to say that Dawn would still get hit, as even though she's implied to be very agile, we rarely see it on screen and the Yeti threw these barrels very fast. So I need a bit stronger evidence than implied to be agile, especially when someone like Lightning, who's shown to be very agile on screen, still got hit by a barrel. From here, the challenge basically ends the same. Sam still goes gamer mode and makes it to the top, where the Yeti quickly deals with him. Mike turns into Chester and rushes Joe's makeup, and when she goes up to the Sasquatch, it laughs at her, and she punches it, winning invincibility for her team. On to the vote, it might seem clear that Dawn goes here, but there's one big factor that saves her to me, and his name is Lightning. Lightning has been very vocal all season about how much he despises losing, and even with Sam's impressive end performance, he's still considered a deadweight to Lightning. And Lightning, while being a complete moron, still probably sees that Dawn would have won them the challenge if Brick let her help in the challenge, and he would be voicing all of this in confessional. Dawn is seen sitting on her bed with a sorrowful look, feeling like she's going home, when Lightning comes into her cabin and sits next to her. Dawn tries to greet him, but Lightning tells her not to steal his time and just listen to his thunder. At the vote, Lightning and Dawn vote for Sam, and Sam and Brick vote for Dawn, causing a 2-2 tie. Brick is angry at Lightning for switching, saying they swore on the Guys Alliance, and Lightning says sure whatever, and he refuses to keep being a loser, so if Doughboy can beat Dawn in the tiebreaker, then he proves he deserves to stay. Speaking of which, I'm pretty sure Dawn beats Sam in just about any tiebreaker. The only consideration I even hesitated on is if it were a fashion related tiebreaker because Dakota could help Sam, but Dakota wasn't present in this elimination ceremony, so she wouldn't be here to help him with even that. I can't say with 100% certainty that Dawn would win since I don't know what the tiebreaker is, but it's usually in the theme of the challenge of that episode, and if it's anything to do with animals or fashion, Dawn has the upper hand. We will just lean into the most likely path, which is Dawn winning the tiebreaker. After the elimination, Chris would ask for a strong volunteer from each team. Joe is still here for the maggots, so she would still volunteer for them, them, but Scott is gone for the rats, so someone else would have to. And since Chris prefaces this as a strong volunteer from each team, I could definitely see Lightning being the volunteer for his team, meaning Lightning and Joe switch teams. Joe still makes a tough impression on the team, as she crushes Brick's handshake and corrects him when he calls it his team, to her team. Dawn has a confessional, bummed that just as she made a friend who saved her, he gets switched onto the other team. Lightning is excited to join the winning team, shaking Cameron's hand, unintentionally shaking his whole body, as he praises them for their success and ensures that they will win all the way to the merge now with him on their side. Sam still has a sweet send-off with Dakota as Chris closes the episode. The episode starts with Joe and Dawn coming back from the elimination ceremony in the last episode as they get acquainted. Dawn is very welcoming to Joe, while Joe asks Dawn which one is her bed. Dawn points out her bed, and Joe goes to lay on it. Dawn mentions that every other bed is available, and Joe says yeah, it must not feel great to have something and watch it get stolen. Dawn tries to explain the situation of Scott being the culprit, but Joe yawns and says they aren't on trial, and she's gonna go to bed, so she better hush and find a new one. She turns around in her bed, her back facing Dawn, as Dawn sighs, and Joe says she better not hear her making out with a bird either. Dawn scoffs silently as a bird is seen on the windowsill batting its eyelashes at Dawn. Dawn tells the bird they aren't like that and goes to bed. Morning comes and Brick gets ready for the day, enjoying the entire male rat cabin to himself. He has a confessional acknowledging the downs of losing Lightning as they were in an alliance, but last night he aided the enemy, so Brick is fine without him. Besides, there are some perks to having a cabin room to yourself. For example, Brick is shown last night walking to the cabin reaching towards the light switch, but gets a smile as he realizes he doesn't have to turn it off and walks to his bed. That's the best night of sleep he's had since they've got here, and with him on his newfound vigor, he will be able to stick it to Joe and stop her from bossing him around on his team. Zoe and Anne Maria are seen in the female maggot's cabin by themselves, not talking to each other but clearly having a lot of animosity. Zoe has a confessional saying it's weird not having Joe there, as she's usually talking all the time to cut the tension between her and Anne Maria, but alone it feels like they are 2 seconds away from having an old western duel. I try not to say anything mean about people, but I hate her. Zoe's confessional ends abruptly. Joe catches up with Brick as they walk out to the dining hall, and Brick, like the original, establishes it's his team and lays out the rules for Joe to follow. The cast gets taken during breakfast, and Chris explains the challenge. Lightning still yells shabam at the cave entrance, making his team fall behind, getting crushed under rocks, this time being the maggots. Originally, the elevator broke when the maggots went on it, but now there's only 3 people on it, so I feel like it's now possible for the elevator to go down safely. The elevator was in terrible condition, but Chris mentioned before the challenge that he set Dakota in the mines for 40 minutes before the challenge, and I have to imagine they used this very elevator as it's the only clear opening into the mines. They even set up the light sources at the top, so it's reasonable to assume under the weight of only 3 people, including Dawn, who seemed to be very dainty, that the elevator would work as they enter the mines. Brick struggles at being able to step out the elevator into the darkness. Dawn, knowing his genuine fear of the dark, tries to comfort him into doing it, but when Joe hears the blind gopher's echoey screech throughout the mines, she pushes him forward as they head down the cave tunnel. The elevator comes back up for the maggots, as Anne Maria scolds Lightning for making them fall behind and messing with her hair. Lightning says they're fine. From his experience as a member of the rats, they are probably weakening the cave monsters for them. Lightning starts an excited "cha," but gets cut off by the sound of the elevator breaking, and finishing with an "oh." The maggots recover from the elevator fall as Lightning quickly stands up after coughing out some dirt and brags about saving time with the quicker fall. The team looks at him annoyed as Zoe hands Lightning the fireflies, telling him to focus on how bright they are. Lightning dismisses her at first but becomes entranced by the fireflies as he shuts up, making the team relaxed. Zoe has a confessional pleads about her babysitting experience coming in handy when working with the Lightning-sized baby. Cameron has a confessional politely noticing the abrasiveness of Lightning and noting how bright shiny lights are also known to entertain cats, moths, and humans under 8 months. The rats continue down the dark tunnel, with Brick still terrified. Joe smirks at his fear, while Dawn wears a worried look. Joe tells Brick that as the leader he should go ahead to make sure it's safe for them. Dawn tries to give Brick an out, saying he doesn't have to do that since she can read his aura and tell he's deathly afraid. But Brick, wanting to stick it to Joe and also not appreciating the support of Dawn, someone he still views as untrustworthy, marches ahead. When Brick marches ahead, Joe has a confessional saying part of her still wants to dropkick Dawn every time she sees her for stealing her whistle. Joe sighs while continuing, saying if she wants to get at Brick, then she needs Twilight's vote, so time to do what she does best, put on her irresistible charm. Joe talks to Dawn about voting out Brick if their team loses, which with their team's record is inevitable. Dawn doesn't take kindly to trashing her team, but also calls out Joe for bullying Brick while he's in mortal fear, and how it's cruel. Joe pretends to be baffled and acts like she's just doing him a favor to get him out of his fear, exposure therapy and all that. Brick can be heard screaming like a girl from down the tunnel and dropping the flashlight. The screaming suddenly stops as Dawn asks if he's okay, and Brick weakly responds that it was just a bug. Joe snickers as she hears Brick weakly admit his fear of something so small, but Dawn furrows her eyebrows at Joe's enjoyment. The maggots still go down the path they originally did, with Liming beginning to name the fireflies. Mike still finds a hat and wears it, bringing out Manitoba. Manitoba still licks some dirt from the floor, and assesses the paths and says they'll go left to the minecarts. Liming, being given instructions, takes his focus off the fireflies, asking why Twig puts on a hat and becomes in charge. If that's the requirement, then Liming wore a headcast for a year, so he should be in charge. The maggots all talk over each other in realization, saying that explains a lot. They all come up to the minecarts, and the bracelets still beep, showing they have less time, scaring Cameron into quickly wanting to get along with this, so he would take the first minecart with Mike, and I see no reason why the other three still wouldn't take the last minecarts by themselves. Brick would still be ahead of the rats on the ground, playing with his flashlight trying to get it on, and once he does, he sees a mutant gopher and runs back to the girls. Joe is about to run with him, but Dawn lightly grabs both of their hands as she points out the gopher is blind, so they'll be fine as long as they stay still and don't make any noise. The team is amazed to see he's lost them after standing still for a few seconds, whispering to each other. Brick asks with a tremble in his voice how they'll get it to leave now, and Dawn says like this, while grabbing Brick's flashlight and throwing it at the foot of Joe. Joe is shocked but can't do much more before the gopher grabs her and digs underground. Dawn is slightly amused as Brick scolds Dawn for letting one of their teammates get taken. Even if it was Joe, you'd never leave a man behind. Dawn tells Brick to calm down, and gophers aren't carnivorous. Besides, she could read the gopher's aura and knew that the gopher didn't want to attack them, which means it was going off someone else's orders, and if they follow the hole it made, then it should take them straight to that creature. Brick gulps as he points out the more narrow hole that Dawn is asking him to go down. Dawn grabs his hand and reassures him about his fear of the darkness, saying she'll let him go in first and take the flashlight, while she'll protect him from behind. Brick nervously agrees to the plan as he walks in the gopher-made tunnel. The maggots still get separated on the minecarts as Liming, Anne-Maria, and Zoe fall into the water. Liming comes out of the water irritated as he blames Mike for suggesting the minecarts and ruining their chances. Anne-Maria, having enough of Liming's idiocracy, starts to point out all the bad luck they've been having and even pointing out how their minecart was the one that went into the water and how he came from the losing team and is poisoning their win streak. Anne-Maria is still shortly after taken underwater by Ezekiel as Zoe panics. Liming gasps deeply too, which seems to be in fear of Anne-Maria, but is quickly revealed in the following confessional that he took her words to heart and is panicking that he is a bad luck charm, not believing this is possible for a lifelong winner. Liming tries to push it off, saying she has no idea what she's talking about, and Liming will prove her wrong, but his eyes show a lot of worry. I don't think Liming would be as cold as Scott to suggest they instantly leave Anne-Maria, but even if they tried looking for her, I don't imagine they could find her in time, so it doesn't matter, and Liming and Zoe would be forced to leave the water anyways. The Mike and Cameron scene still plays out the same, with Cameron getting Mike up by acting like Joe, and they continue in the mines to look for the rest of their team. Brick and Dawn are traveling in the mine as Brick expresses his ease at looking forward and knowing someone's got his back. He becomes slightly panicked at Dawn not saying anything, but she refocuses and apologizes for being lost in thought, as she says she was just thinking about how gophers don't run on hierarchies, so it doesn't make any sense that they would have an alpha gopher for them to be taking orders from. Brick suggests that maybe he was a mother gopher, as he always listens to his mom. Dawn says, yeah, maybe, while clearly looking dismissive and still thinking about what could be commanding the gophers. Then the Anne-Maria scene of waking up from the water in front of Ezekiel would still happen, revealing Ezekiel as the gopher leader. The maggots would still reunite as they hear Anne-Maria's voice and follow it to the main room. The maggots from the original cave entrance would rock in on Anne-Maria, happy with a diamond, and Joe annoyed at the scene while being held captive by one of the gophers, like the original. The rats would poke their heads from a tunnel above the ground, but from the same direction as the maggots made by the gopher tunnel they followed. Brick is excited to see Joe as he is about to yell about how they're here to save her, but before he does, Dawn quickly covers his mouth, telling him if he yells, they'll hear him. Brick struggles with Dawn, being insistent they have to save Joe and not leave them behind. Like the original, Cameron would worry about the gophers picking up on their scent, and the gophers do so as they surround the team. Dawn, hearing about the smell, quickly realizes they are sensitive to smell as she stops fighting Brick to inform him she has a plan to save Joe. The gophers remain surrounding the maggots as Brick isn't being held by the gophers to throw his boot to save them anymore. Liming sighs as the gophers surround them and goes into an impassioned and delusional speech, mentioning how he knows he's a bad luck charm and the gophers clearly must have smelt it on him. Cameron, Mike, and Zoe are extremely confused as Cameron tries to point out how he just explained how they have a strong sense of smell, but Liming pushes Cameron over, saying a strong sense of smell for losers. In continuing his speech, saying he will do the good for his team like his papa taught him to do in football, and should sacrifice himself, with a single tear running down his face. He runs towards a gopher, but is quickly stopped when the gopher screeches at him. This causes Liming to drop the jar of fireflies, as the gophers disperse from the flies in the air. Dawn tells Brick her plan to throw one of his smelly boots at the base of the gopher holding Joe, so the gopher will free her. Brick is confused, saying it doesn't smell that bad, while accidentally pointing the boot at Dawn's face, making her gag and turn away. Brick realizes her plan would work, and despite not wanting to use her plans for still thinking of her as a traitor, would agree to go through with it to save Joe. so he throws his boot at the foot of the gopher, and it makes the gopher let go of Joe. Lightning touches himself, amazed he's still intact, and views this as a sign that his curse is gone. Mike is about to break it to Lightning, but Zoe stops him as she feeds into Lightning's thoughts, telling him to make a dash for the statue of his newfound luck, and Lightning does so. Joe is coughing on the ground for being dropped, and the gopher's running around the place. She looks on the ground in front of her, noticing Brick's boot, and is disgusted when the smell wafts into her nose. Lightning makes his dash to the statue, stepping on the back of Joe's head, pushing her face through into Brick's boot as he gets to the throne of his team statue. But like the original, Zeke attacks him, making him drop the statue. Dawn and Brick jump down from the gopher-made tunnel, as Chris informs everyone to drop their backpacks with bombs in them. Dawn is completely stunned by this revelation, and since she is an animal whisperer and wouldn't want any animals to get hurt, she tells Brick to go get the statue while she uses his other boot to herd the gophers out of the tunnel. Brick has no time to give his opinion on the plan, as Dawn is already in motion, even somehow removing his other boot without him noticing. Brick runs up to Joe, whose head is still in his boot, pulling her head out, telling her they have to move. Joe's face is green as she is heard vomiting, while the camera shows Brick's rinsing expression. Brick has a confessional, slightly blushing from embarrassment. He says that could have been from radiation poisoning. No one really knows. Mike and Anne-Maria come upon Lightning defeating Zeke, with Mike picking up the statue. Lightning kicks Zeke across the room, as Mike tosses the statue to Anne-Maria, having it land in her hair, as he goes back for Zoe and Cameron. Brick grabs his team statue, as Joe sits in the minecart, but like the original, Brick sees Mike struggling to hold back a gopher, and against Joe's advice, Brick goes back for them, breaking his team statue on the gopher's head. Dawn comes back from the tunnel after herding the gophers out, and gasps in shock at seeing Brick hit a gopher. She's unsure what to say, but Brick quickly picks her up and carries her to the minecarts, placing her in one, as everyone rides out of the caves. Because Brick broke his team's statue to save the other team, the maggots win the challenge. Lightning, delirious from the minecart ride, starts to loudly celebrate at breaking his curse, but Zoe simply shushes him as she assures him it's bedtime. After the vote, it can really go any way here. Everyone has a reason to vote for anyone else on the team. Going over who Joe would vote for seems like a good place to start, as I definitely see her talking to the other person to convince them of her plan, which could definitely sway Brick or Dawn's vote. She obviously isn't a fan of Dawn for both stealing what she still believes to be her, and breaking a flashlight at her feet to make the gopher take her. And I think Joe probably would have been voting Dawn right until the end of the challenge, where Brick broke their statue and we're back to save the other team. Joe already has a standing rivalry with Brick and wanted him gone, but Brick proved when he defied her in that moment that Joe doesn't have a strong control over Brick, which given the strategy we see of Joe later in the season, having #1 allies like Lightning and Brick, this would key her on that she doesn't have any further use for Brick, because Brick will defy her when his interest clashes with hers. Also, Brick just garnered a lot of favor with the other team, and Joe is probably smart enough to see that if she went to the merge with him, he would definitely be able to get the numbers to vote her out, and because they're in a rivalry, he would probably think of doing that sooner or later. And even though Dawn has peeved her off a bunch, Dawn, at least from Joe's perspective, has nobody. Maybe you could say Joe would worry about her and Lightning, but that's not nearly as bad as Brick having the loyalty of Mike, Cameron, and Zoe. So Dawn would seem like the safer bet for Joe to keep in the game, as her #1 since Dawn has outcasted herself from any of her options. Dawn in this moment would be planning to vote out Joe, as she saw a much more human side of Brick today with his fear of the dark. And as much as it annoys her, she can understand why Brick doesn't trust her. Also, Joe has made a more negative impression on Dawn with the amount of taunting and bullying she has seen towards Brick. This would lead to Dawn having a conversation with Brick about the idea of voting out Joe. Brick says he's on board, but it's obvious that he's extremely hesitant about the plan. Brick has a confessional saying he appreciates Dawn helping him out with his fear of the dark, but he doesn't know if he can in good conscience work with someone that did what she did, as it goes against his entire moral code. After this talk, Joe would have a chat with Dawn, starting off by acting impressed by her backbone of getting Joe caught by a gopher to follow it, saying that's exactly the kind of thing she would do to win, but sabotaging their team like Brick did, there's no way they should stand for that. Dawn tries to defend Brick, saying he saved lives, but Joe points out how it couldn't have been nice for her to watch him hit an innocent gopher though. Joe cuts to the point and says they should vote him off, because his best interests aren't with them, asking Dawn if she really thinks Brick would want to work with someone like her. Dawn again defends herself, saying Scott was the one who stole from them, and Joe, trying to appeal to Dawn, says perhaps that's true, but it doesn't seem like Brick is buying it anytime soon. Dawn looks to the side for a frown, thinking earlier about how he seemed hesitant to work with her, and in a 2-1 vote, Brick is eliminated. This was a really tough vote to come to a conclusion to. I could genuinely see any of these three getting eliminated here, but what weighed heaviest to me the most was Brick going so hard on a strong moral code that would hinder his ability to work with Dawn, especially since it's so early into him starting to see the good in her. Also, Joe wanting to target him more than Dawn means he didn't really have an in with Joe either. Both of these leave me to Brick with weaker ties to the other two, and as much as it would be hard for Dawn, I do think she would realize Brick isn't fully on her side. Brick would have struggled as well, but ultimately voted for Joe, making him even more hurt that Dawn went back on her plan. Dawn apologizes to him, saying she knows he doesn't trust her. Joe bids Brick a goodbye while calling him Sergeant Wiz. Brick's elimination is the same, with Mike, Cameron, and Zoe saluting him, and Anne-Maria still quits the game and joins him the culprit because she got the fake diamond from Zeke, and still thinks that it's real. Dakota, like the original, gets put on the maggots in Anne-Maria's place. The episode begins the same with the cast waking up on rafts at sea, and Cameron realizing they were fed mutant turkey that knocked them out. Dawn would be muttering in her sleep having a nightmare, and Joe would ruffle her hair telling it's morning time Sleeping Beauty. Dawn, suddenly awakened, holds Joe by the shirt, saying tall with spikes, green hair and red eyes, "The beast is coming." Joe looks at her confused, asking if this is like a riddle or something. Liming has a confessional, bothered by having Dakota on his team again, as she didn't try very hard last time, and Liming just got a good thing going with his team, so she better not blow it. Chris would arrive on a jet ski to explain the challenge, but before he does, Dakota taunts him while growing taller and growing out green hair. Dawn has a confessional, sighing, saying she knew Dakota shouldn't have stayed here, and she should have warned her more thoroughly. Joe is shocked by the transformation and recounts what Dawn said, but asks why she said red eyes since Dakota doesn't have red eyes yet, and Dawn just tells her to wait because this isn't her final form. The challenge begins and the rats get the early lead because Dakota throws her team's poster to use as a paddle from her anger of seeing Chris and the start of her transformation. Like the original, the rats paddling ahead would run into the massive octopus, which would grab them. The maggots still go into the water and start kicking, and because Scott isn't here, I don't really think Fang would be here. I guess he could be, but it doesn't really matter either way because Dakota Zord would completely wreck him. So, whatever. Joe tries hitting the octopus with the team sign to very little effect. Now, because Dawn is an animal whisperer, I had to make a bit of a weird Google search to see if octopuses could feel empathy, and they're actually considered very empathetic creatures, even feeling empathy for human researchers, so Dawn, even despite it being a mutant, would be able to pacify the octopus. Joe, abusing this kindness, sicks the octopus on the other team by telling it they eat calamari. The octopus swims over to attack the other team, as Dawn scolds Joe for playing dirty like that. Joe reminds Dawn that they have Dakota, so they'll be fine, and she's just giving them a fighting chance because she doesn't want either of them to get eliminated. Joe has a confessional saying she meant that, Joe is included in either of them, and she doesn't want to get eliminated. English diction is a beautiful thing. Like the original, Cameron still does the plan of taunting the octopus to make it attack one side of their raft, and launch the entire team to shore first. Joe and Dawn arrive on the shore shortly after, with Joe annoyed at not making it there first. Dakota grows taller with red eyes and jumps up at Chris's helicopter. Joe points out the red eyes and asks Dawn if that's her final, but Dawn interrupts, saying not quite yet. Chris explains the next part of the challenge and mentions burying Sam with Gwen, angering Dakota and having her transform into her final form. Joe is holding on to Dawn in fear, telling Dawn this has to be it, and Dawn says it is. Liming has a confessional, cheering Dakota for not letting him down, because with her new form, she's a dream pick for any football team. Liming gets a bit sad as he realizes that he should be the top pick, and starts assuring himself that he's still number one, and he's got to remind her of that. The second part of the challenge would begin, and like the original, Dawn and Joe would be given the penalty metal belts, and this would put a heavy strain on Dawn, as they were referred to as being 120 pounds, and I don't see a smaller girl like Dawn being able to carry that so easily. The maggots would come in front of the swamp first, where Mike would reveal while looking at the map that the way around the swamp is too long and they have to go through. Lightning, watching Dakota Zord carry Zoe, rolls his eyes and says, "Please, anyone can carry a teammate like that." He quickly grabs Cameron by his back and carries him as he jogs in place to show the lack of strain it's causing, all the while Cameron repeatedly asks to be put down. The rats would come up a bit after, and originally they knew to go through the swamp because Scott was here on the other team and sabotaged his team by drawing an arrow in the dirt towards the swamp, so they wouldn't have that anymore because he's not here, and it's possible to think that they would try going around, but considering that they're falling behind due to Dawn's struggle of carrying the weight, Joe would suggest they cut through the swamp to win. Dawn is hesitant, but when Joe mentions it will save them steps, Dawn agrees. The maggots travel through the swamp as they provoke a large mutant alligator. The scene plays out pretty similar to the original, with the exception of Lightning still holding Cameron, and trying to throw off his strength would probably throw Cameron like a football to the branch of the tree while scaling it quickly himself. But otherwise, Mike would still turn in his fat lawn and climb the tree, but quickly reverts back when he sees Zoe is in danger, letting Cameron know that it is a trigger to always make Mike revert back from any personality seeing Zoe in danger. Dakota Zord would come in last second to beat up the alligator and save Zoe. Lightning would be insulted at Dakota so easily handling the massive mutant crocodile, saying like he couldn't do the same. And like the original, many smaller crocs come attack him. The rest of the maggots with Dakota Zord's help clear out the phone bush and continue through. The rats come up on Liming, who just got attacked by the smaller alligators, bragging to the rats team as if they were the mutants, about the alligators giving up after he lost most of his blood, and finishing it with, "Should take that, Dakotas," and he falls into the tree. Joe chuckles at the sight while beginning to walk past him, but Dawn grabs her hand, insisting they can't just leave him here. Joe rolls her eyes, saying they're already behind enough as it is. Besides, it would be rude to interrupt his nap. Dawn glares at Joe, making her agree to drag him out of the swamp. Dawn has a confessional acknowledging the trouble of Liming's pride, but he helped her out when she was in a vulnerable position, so she owes him to pay it back. The end of this challenge is complicated. So the maggots get out of the swamp first, and without Scott to sabotage them and lie about hearing Sam and Gwen somewhere else, it seems like they might win because they wouldn't waste a lot of time digging somewhere that isn't where Sam is hidden. But the thing is, for some reason, Dakota Zord isn't here with the maggots out of the swamp. Why? I don't know. She just finished fighting the mutant croc, but I guess she was preoccupied in the swamp with something else because she doesn't come out until the wooden box holding Sam is already found. This might not seem like that big of a deal, but without Dakota Zord to break through the box, the maggots would actually have to find the key, which was just under a random rock, and I have no reason to really think they would just go looking under random rocks to find a key. Also, originally when the maggots pass over the box, Gwen doesn't make any noises, but when the rats happen to pass, Gwen does make noises, cluing them in where to dig. So this is kind of a weird circumstance where coming behind is actually beneficial because you get a clue into where the box is from Gwen's panicking. This is mostly void with the map that marks the location of the box, but Zoe ended up getting the map teared up when she was trying to climb the tree in the swamp and Dakota saved her last second, which is something that still happened in this universe. And without a map and the rats actually having a metal detector to potentially find the key to the wooden box, I actually think they have the better shot of winning here. This is sorta, maybe kind of a long shot, since there isn't a ton of reason for the rats to use a metal detector since they don't know the metal keys, but there are two other things that make this pretty solid to me. One is Dawn. She is known to read the auras of people and would have a much stronger sense of feeling human life below them. And two is originally Scott brought Zoe ahead, so when Vito came out because a thorn bush pulled Mike's shirt up, Zoe noticed it and was unhappy, but she also didn't confront him that much because Scott already took her away to the box that he supposedly heard. Now that Zoe would be near them when Vito came out, I do think she'd be a lot more direct with Mike and judging him since she really hates Vito. And this discomfort would probably cause Mike or maybe Cameron to try and quickly continue in the challenge by running ahead so they can move on from that confrontation. Again, there are a lot of weird variables here, but at the end of the day, I still do think the rats have a better shot of finding the box here, so they would win the challenge. There's not really anything to talk about with the vote. Even though Zoe is a bit put off by Mike and Cameron, she definitely wouldn't vote either of them, and I could see Mike finding time to talk with her, and with her still being a bit upset, he would offer to vote whatever way she wants to try and make it up to her. And Zoe would say she wants to vote out Dakota because she's starting to scare Zoe with how friendly she's trying to be to Zoe, but she's really strong and doesn't realize her own power now. These three of Zoe, Mike, and Cameron don't really like Lightning, but I do think even without a scene like the one I just mentioned, they would vote out Dakota. Since they have to think that the merge is coming soon, even Final 6 is a bit late to start a merge, so a fan of the show like Zoe would know there's no way that they would have a Final 5 merge. And this version of Dakota is way too powerful for them to be in the merge against, and Liming would also vote Dakota since his pride is hurt by her being so much stronger than him. Thus in a 4-1 vote, Dakota probably voting Lightning, Dakota Zord is eliminated. The episode will start with Chris merging the teams and destroying the maggot's cabin. Dawn has a confessional worried if the other team still has a sour perception of her, and it will be harder to hide now if the team's dissolved. Hopefully she still has a connection with Zoe, but just to be safe she should remind her that she's not a threat. Cameron would still approach Joe about the idea of working together now to have some brains to complement her brawn. Joe originally had Lightning as her lackey and rejected this offer, but now that she doesn't have Lightning and really just Dawn, who has already shown she isn't as easy to manipulate as Lightning, Joe would be pleased with Cameron's advocacy for himself and agree to the prospect, saying it intrigues her. Joe has a confessional noting that she has Dawn, but she's still in the spotlight for stealing everyone's stuff, so if Joe wants to keep her around, then she has to start thinking of other allies. Cameron seems like a good enough dummy, and if Dawn can use her connection to Team Rats, then she could pull over Lightning. Then the four of them would have the say in getting rid of Mike or Zoe, which is the right call to Joe since she doesn't like the idea of a tight couple so far into the game. She starts listing off all the annoying ways they're into each other, but she starts to become a bit teary-eyed as she continues, knowing she doesn't have any love like that. She glares into the confessional camera and kicks it, breaking it, being embarrassed by showing emotion. Zoe enters the female cabin side as birds are heard chirping. Dawn is revealed to be orchestrating them as she invites Zoe into their cabin. Zoe giggles at the formal invitation, bowing down and saying she's humbled to make her presence. They are both seen sitting on Dawn's bed talking with each other, as Zoe asks about how she's been putting up with Joe, because Zoe knows from her experience of being on the maggots that she is a lot. Dawn grimaces and says no comment while they both chuckle. Dawn continues saying she feels like they're always talking about her, so she's curious to know how it's been for Zoe. Zoe sighs as she talks about how weird Mike and even Cameron have been lately. She doesn't pry Dawn for information since she knows Dawn doesn't want to talk about Mike, but Zoe really likes Mike and all the secrets are freaking her out. Dawn has a confessional curious about Cameron acting weird, wondering if he knows Mike's secret as well. Dawn holds Zoe's hand, feeling her pain, and says she'll have a talk with Mike to try and help her out. Zoe is touched, asking really, and Dawn says of course that's what friends do for each other. Chris would explain the challenge of finding keys in the mess hall, and it commences. When Cameron sticks his hand under the table, Dawn pulls him away at the very last second before the mewing cockroach underneath bites his hand. Cameron thanks her. Dawn decides to very lightly probe, saying about Mike, and before she can continue, Cameron says, "You know about his split personality disorder too?" Dawn has a confessional, amazed that Cameron has kept the secret this long. Dawn acknowledges she does, and sarcastically says, taking a guess, you do too. She continues reciting what Zoe said earlier about Mike, and feeling nervous about the secret he's obviously keeping. They have to get Mike to tell her. Cameron is unsure about messing more in those personal matters, thinking they should give Mike more time. But as they are discussing this, Zoe's hair gets pulled by the same cockroach into the bucket, and this time not being exploited by Scott, Mike quickly comes to her rescue, pulling her free, and both of them falling on the ground, with light blushing. Cameron retracts his statement, saying they have to get them together. Dawn smiles, and they both continue in the challenge. For the keys, there are 3 that I see remaining unchanged. Joe, Liming, and Zoe have no reason to look in different spots than they did in the original to find a key. But Mike probably wouldn't look in the trash anymore for the golden key, since he only did that because Scott told him to. Cameron probably wouldn't look under the table anymore since Dawn saved and warned him off of the cockroach under there, and Dawn just wasn't here originally, so I just don't have a clear idea of where she'd look. I do think though that Dawn would challenge the cockroach under her table because of her animal whispering experience. She would shake the table from the top to make the cockroach scared, and grab the key. Cameron and Mike would both be pretty stumped, with Cameron getting the idea to place a hat on Mike, bringing out Manitoba, who was first able to find the key that Scott originally found, but then his treasure hunting instincts would kick in, and he would find the gold key, which he would obviously take for himself, thinking it's the most valuable, leaving Cameron with the other key that Scott originally had. In the chef's junkyard, before Chris explains the challenge, Joe would whisper to Dawn about touching base with Liming and using their shared toxic rat trauma of being losers, to get him on her side. Dawn is about to defend her team, but stops and just agrees with Joe. Chris explains the challenge, and once it begins, Dawn pulls Liming back to talk about them being reunited, and how they should work together as the only original Team Rat members left. Liming rolls his eyes saying, yeah, like he wants to identify with that miserable team anymore. He switched onto the winning side, and now Liming is done carrying anyone else, he's a team of 1. Liming is about to turn away and continue in the challenge, but Chef captures both him and Dawn. Like the original, Cameron uses his nuts that he found under the table to fend the squirrels off, letting everyone else continue. Mike would be bummed when he sees his gold cart, which is unrideable, but Cameron, using his quick thinking, suggests for Mike to hook his cart on the back of Zoe's, so they spend more time together, similar to how Scott did with Mike. Zoe is a little apprehensive because it is the merge and she still feels a little off about Mike, but she agrees because she wants to pay it back to Mike for saving her in the kitchen. Mike thanks Cameron as Cameron whispers to him that he has to tell Zoe today. Mike is about to question him more, but can't with the others, so just agrees. Mike has a confessional worried, still freaking out about the idea of telling Zoe. Joe sees Mike and Zoe working together and still wanting to break the power couple, offers to take Mike instead, but when her go-kart is seen to stutter, the choice becomes solidified with Zoe. Joe tries to butter up Cameron to do the same thing for her as Zoe did for Mike, but Cameron pretends like his go-kart is too loud and rides off, making Joe annoyed. Zoe's go-kart was shown to be far and away the fastest, so she and Mike would get to the first landmark before anyone else. Mike and Zoe comment on each other's tags, with Mike lamely trying to flirt, saying it makes sense that her tag would be a heart because she's so lovely. Mike face palms as Zoe giggles and tells her his tag, the checkmark, makes sense too because he's the right kind of guy. They both smile at each other as they get back into the go-karts, and past Cameron, who had just arrived. Cameron, like the original, spends way too much time creating an elaborate tag, not understanding it's supposed to be something simple. Liming and Dawn are seen in the cage together, as Liming panics about this needing to be the new start for him, and Dawn already blowing it for him, insulting her by saying he supposes that she still has thievery in her blood, stealing this win from him. Dawn, being brought to the end of the line with constantly being called a thief, insults Liming back, saying he's one to speak because he clearly stole the word suppose from someone else because he's too dumb to possibly know it himself. Liming yells back at her that reading was a difficult subject for him. Dawn continues, saying he must mean "shuh" subject, because the only reason he would keep beginning words of "shuh" is if he truly thought that's how they were said. Fang, outside of the cage, now looks at the two with a worried look at their intense fighting. Joe is seen repeatedly hitting her head on the go-kart's horn, while it slowly creeps up on the first landmark, and upon seeing Cameron just finish his advanced portrait tag, Joe informs him that this is a race, not art school. Cameron groans as he realizes his mistake. Joe places an arm over Cameron's shoulder, saying she is impressed by how far he's come since episode 1, but it's clear that he could still use her help, and she definitely needs his help at this moment. Cameron nods in agreement while they set up the same thing with their go-karts as they did on Mike and Zoe's, so that Cameron can carry Joe in the challenge. Zoe and Mike are seen tagging the second location. After tagging, Mike asks Zoe if they can stay back for a bit. Zoe is confused but agrees to. Mike sweats a bit as he tries to nervously explain his disorder, but is only able to get out "we need to talk" before the octopus from the tree reaches out to attack Zoe. Mike quickly changes into Svetlana and acrobatically saves Zoe while dancing in front of the monster's eye, while Svetlana moves out of the way at the last second and makes the monster hit itself in the eye and go back in the tree. Mike is confused as he returns, and Zoe pulls Mike into a hug, calling him her hero, making Mike completely lose his train of thought, wanting to delay telling her about his disorder because he doesn't want to ruin the good moment, and they continue in the challenge. Joe and Cameron are seen tagging the second location, and then traveling to the next. While traveling, Joe suggests the threat of Mike and Zoe as a power couple. Cameron frowns at the thought, asking what she's trying to say. Joe says one of them has to go tonight. Cameron is reluctant, saying they can't get rid of them before Mike tells her. Joe raises an eyebrow, asking before Mike tells her what. Cameron tries to pull tension away, but Joe continues pressuring him, saying if they're really in alliance then there can't be any secrets between them. And Cameron, not being good with secrets, eventually blurts out that Mike has multiple personality disorder. Joe is shocked, and Cameron asks if she understands why they can't get rid of one of them now before Mike reveals that, and Joe says she gets it, crystal clear now, while wearing a mischievous grin. A mischievous grin? Joe has a confessional enjoying the new information and thinking about Mike and realizing that Vito is always around when Mike is shirtless, so that must be a trigger. Fang is seen yawning and rolling his eyes as he still hears Liming and Dawn arguing. Dawn and Liming are seen sitting on the floor, exhausted from yelling at each other. The fight ends with Dawn confused about how Liming is tired even after all the physical stuff he does, and Liming says Brainbone is not used to this much exertion and calls a timeout. After a bit, Dawn is heard softly crying. Liming points it out, asking if she is alright. Dawn looks at him with no tears yet but watery eyes, as she confesses it's been so difficult for everyone ostracizing her when all she did was try to help the team get rid of Scott, who was the one sabotaging them. Liming, seeing her so vulnerable, actually feels bad, apologizing for what he said, and he doesn't really think she's thrifty like that. Dawn, not believing him, asks why he would possibly say any of that then, and Liming opens himself up a bit and admits he was just upset about not being able to win, and none of what he said actually had to do anything with her. Dawn calms down a little as she believes that and points out that it's written all over his aura, his desire to win. She noticed it the very first second they met and always wondered where that came from in him. Liming talks about his family life and guesses that it comes from his pop and how he really wants to make him proud back home, and he can't imagine how embarrassed he's been watching him so far. Dawn places a hand on Liming's shoulder, saying she's sure that he's proud of him, and if he isn't, Dawn says trying to lead into the lesson that winning isn't everything, but Liming gets an inspired look as he doubles down and stands up, saying if he isn't, then he still has time to make him proud. Dawn exclaims a "huh?" as Liming quickly opens the bars and urges Dawn to leave with him. Dawn, annoyed, stands up, asking if he didn't learn anything about himself with that talk. Liming says nothing new, I am still so awesome, but I did learn something about you, scary girl. You aren't that bad, and I believe you didn't steal anyone's stuff. Dawn smiles at him and pulls him in for a surprisingly kinda tight hug, and as she hugs him, she sees over his shoulder that Fang is sobbing with a smile at their scene, informing Liming they should keep moving. Mike and Zoe are at the base of the last tagging location while discussing who should get the win. Mike offers it to her, saying he wouldn't have stood a chance without a go-kart, and gives her a boost up the totem pole. Mike has a confessional saying if there's any time to break this news, helping her win invincibility isn't half bad of a time. Zoe smiles at Mike's generosity and scales the pole. As she's climbing, Mike again starts a discussion of his multiple personalities, and Zoe takes an interest in being blunt that she likes him the most of all of them. This makes Mike a bit nervous to continue, but as he starts to, he is interrupted by Joe and Cameron riding up. Cameron asks Mike if he told her yet, and before Mike can answer that question, Joe notices Zoe about to win and grabs Cameron's spray can and throws it at Zoe, making her fall a bit and catch herself on the wing of the totem pole. Mike panics and scolds Joe while about to scale to help Zoe, but Joe tells him to take a chill pill, Vito, and rips off Mike's shirt, bringing out Vito. Cameron worries as Vito mentions Anne Maria, trying to play it along like it's still Mike, saying, "Oh, so you can tell her that you really like Zoe." Vito simply responds, "Who's Zoe?" Cameron has a confessional saying he doesn't even know why he tried that. Joe quickly scales up the totem pole past Zoe, tagging to the top and coming back down. It's at this point that everyone gets the video that Chef made making a new landmark under the pretense of it being Chris, and Joe tells Cameron to give her a ride to that final landmark. Cameron responds with a direct no, saying their alliance is over. Jo rolls her eyes as she detaches her card from Cameron's and continues on the challenge, bragging that she has enough of a lead anyways. Dawn and Liming are seen tagging the second location and high-fiving each other while driving third. Cameron tries to get his hoodie on Vito to bring Mike out, but Vito pushes him aside, saying red's not his color. Vito hears Zoe screaming as she's losing her grip, and he eyes her, saying maybe red is. Zoe falls and lands in Vito's arms, who attempts to flirt with her. Zoe, in rage, squirms out of Vito's arms, yelling at Mike, asking what's wrong with him. Vito is shocked by Zoe being so rude with him, saying Anne Maria was much more delightful than her. Zoe slaps Mike out cold. Zoe instantly feels bad when she sees how hurt Mike is, shaking Mike to see if he's okay. Dawn and Liming arrive at the third location, with Dawn quickly worrying about what happened with Mike, while Liming, unbothered, is scaling the totem pole. Zoe explains that she slapped him too hard. Dawn gasps, asking what's the right amount of force for a slap. Cameron notes that Mike called Anne Maria more delightful. Dawn reassesses Mike and says that seems to be the right amount of force actually. Zoe keeps patting Mike and calling out his name, leading to the same scene of Mike beating his other personalities and taking over control of his personalities. Also, while Mike is beating himself up while knocked out, Dawn and Cameron at the same time would say that Mike is fighting his other personalities for control, unintentionally revealing to Zoe that Mike has multiple personality disorder. Liming jumps down the totem pole as he continues in the challenge. Mike would still break free and regain consciousness, revealing to Zoe that he has multiple personality disorder, with Zoe accepting him for the oddball he is. Chris would arrive at the third location, ready to reveal the winner, surprised that Jo and Liming aren't there yet, and Cameron points out they went to the fourth landmark, causing Chris to realize they were tricked, probably by Duncan, and start heading to the fourth landmark, where Liming finishes his large tag over Chris's face just before Jo can, and celebrates before Chris informs him that he didn't win because the fourth landmark was a trick. Liming has a confessional saying he's at peace with this. He takes some deep breaths, but is then heard yelling and punching the wall of the confessional booth as it ends abruptly. Not much to talk about with the vote. Jo has the sole vote for the elimination, and since she wants the power couple gone, it's definitely either Mike or Zoe. And she probably leans more so Mike because he's the bigger theft the skills of his personalities possesses. If this was All-Star Zoe who just became an acrobat for no reason at all, then it would be closer, but this Zoe is pretty average at challenges, so Mike is definitely the easy choice here. Mike's elimination goes the same with Zoe wishing him a goodbye, and Mike giving her a necklace of his face to remember him by, which in retrospect is kind of a weird gift to give somebody. The episode begins with Dawn meditating outside, while Jo walks up to her and asks how she would feel about creating a girls' alliance while they have the numbers. Dawn stares at Jo, stopping her, saying she heard what she did to Zoe and Mike yesterday, and she isn't interested in working with her, and I doubt Zoe would be either. Jo says she just did what she had to win, and it wasn't personal. Besides, Jo did her a favor. Zoe would have always been more loyal to Mike than her, but now Zoe has a new position for her #1 ally. Jo tells her to stop being such a sob and start thinking realistically. Dawn wears a fake smile as she decides to play along, saying they should get more logical, pointing out that Jo hasn't gone on any morning runs ever since Britt got eliminated. She hypothesizes that logically thinking it must be because Jo misses him. Jo wears a sour look on her face while having a confessional asking what happened to people's gratitude nowadays. Chris would still fly in the Zeppelin and explain the challenge and bring out Heather. When Zoe briefly considers quitting but gets brought back by the prospects of money, Jo tells her she'll never win it. Zoe gets mad at Jo getting in her face, saying yeah she will. Zoe has the same confessional towards Scott originally about how Jo brings out the jerk in her, which is invigorating because Jo deserves it for eliminating Mike. Mostly everyone who was here originally still is, and I don't really have any reason to believe that Dawn would insist on picking from the trash bag sooner than anybody else, so everyone else would still get the same air vehicles, and Dawn would get the bird that Scott originally got. Once the challenge starts, Liming would ask Cameron about what he needs to make a helicopter. Cameron lists off a couple things before Jo grabs him and tells Liming to get his own nerd. When Jo has pulled Cameron far away enough, she lays an arm over his shoulder and asks him about what she needs to make a hot air balloon. Cameron pushes her off him, saying he meant what he said yesterday, and he's not working with her after what she did. Jo scoffs, asking, "You too?" explaining again that Mike and Zoe were always going to be more loyal to each other, and she's just helping everyone's game. You know, the one for $1 million. And she meant what she said yesterday too, and that they need each other. Cameron can't really expect us to have a chance against the Limings of the world. Let her be a tool that he can use to further both of their games. Jo cuts in with a confessional, saying and once they both get to the finale, she will crush him like the worm he is. Cameron agrees that she makes a fair point, and agrees to help her find the stuff that she'll need to make the hot air balloon. Cameron has a confessional acknowledging the obvious that he is an 89-pound weakling, and his best bet is to stay as invisible as possible, hiding behind people like Jo, and then Cameron can get her eliminated later when there's no people that can easily crush him. Cameron finishes making Jo's hot air balloon, and like the original, Jo tells him to sabotage Liming because they have to make sure he doesn't win today. Cameron asks why. Jo responds that he asks a lot more questions than before, and she has to go find Zoe, so just launch the crud on the stud. Everyone's air vehicle remains the same, as there's no reason for any of them to change. Dawn is new though, and I don't imagine she'd do what Scott did by tearing the feathers off the seagulls, because that would be terrible to her. Instead, I just see her animal whispering to the seagulls, and getting them to bring her 15 more or so, and attach a harness to herself, tying a rope to the harness, and then the other end of the rope to a long pole of sorts that the seagulls can grab onto and fly with to carry her. This is obviously a bit cartoony, but Dawn is considered to be very dainty, so I don't think it's too unrealistic for her. Joe finds Zoe with her finished airplane, complimenting the craftsmanship. Zoe furrows her eyebrows at Joe's presence, trying to insult her, but being so nice and bad and insulting that she doesn't come with anything good, leading to Joe patronizingly saying, "Nice try, sport." But she continues talking about Liming and saying they should vote him out because he's a threat and it's late into the game. Zoe gets the propeller on the front of her plane to start spinning, and it begins pulling Joe towards it. As Joe starts pushing away from the windy force, she tells Zoe to think about it because you know I'm right. Zoe has a confessional admitting that as much as she hates Joe, she makes a fair point, but she's willing to let Liming survive around if it means Joe's gone. Cameron will still end up finding the rocket while trying to pour trash on Liming, and win the advantage for completing his aircraft first, a smoke machine. And Joe would end up taking it from him to, quote, keep it safe. Heather would overtake the Zeppelin and change the challenge of taking it down to win immunity. Dawn is stunned when Chris shows the mutant fire-breathing goat, that's a mouthful, and suggests using them as ammo. Joe taunts Dawn, saying she shouldn't live by her bird card so much, she doesn't have to sit on these eggs to protect them. Dawn berates Joe back, using her aura to know she feels shame about not being desirable to guys, something she lightly mentioned in the mines, and tells Joe she's just jealous that she'll never have the chance to be a mother hen herself. Joe frowns slightly, but then has a confessional saying like she wants a screaming devil growing inside her, the only thing she needs to multiply is the zeros in her bank account. Dawn would fall a bit behind in the beginning of the challenge to take the remaining eggs in the basket, talking to them and promising to return them when the challenge is over. Joe, Cameron, and Liming would all be pretty high up, already near the back of the Zeppelin's motors, as Liming and Joe begin tossing eggs. Zoe originally got thrown off track by Scott, but either way we see her struggle with the airplane's controls later, so I don't think she'd be here with these three just quite yet, and Dawn is a bit behind for staying back for the eggs, and also seagulls probably aren't the fastest aircraft. The same stuff if these three happened to the original. Cameron would spin out Liming while trying to control the rocket, Joe would stick the goats onto the blimp, Heather comes out to hit the goats with the jemmies, and Joe tells Cameron to come in front of her to cover. Dawn barely comes up behind and below Joe, trying to tell Cameron to not help her, but Joe uses the smoke machine on Dawn's birds to get her to fall down a good while before Cameron could hear any of it. And Liming wouldn't get Cameron to turn on Joe since he doesn't have a history of Joe, and would instead take the opportunity to fly in front of them to catch one of the jemmies being thrown and throw it back at Heather, making Heather dodge and hide back into the blimp. Zoe would still lose control of the airplane, making a big circle and falling off her plane, but landing onto a goat, which she ends up pacifying by grabbing onto its horns. As Dawn falls from Joe smoking her birds, she almost loses grip of the egg basket, making her hold onto it tightly in front of her. Some goats come to attack her, but one notices its eggs and flies next to the basket, making all the other goats cease fire. Dawn reads the goat's aura in pain, and correctly picks out which egg belongs to it and hands it to the goat. She pets it, apologizing for its grievances, but remembering there's a challenge at hand, and hearing Joe above her, she sticks the goats onto Joe, telling them that she has their eggs, and she's throwing them. This leads to Joe quickly being taken down by the number of goats breathing fire her way, and her aircraft being very easily taken down by fire on her air balloon. So, fire, air balloon, you get it. As she's falling, she sees Liming ramming the vehicle into the front of the blimp, trying to overtake Heather, and tells Cameron to make sure Liming doesn't win. Cameron gets a determined look on his face, and the rest of the challenge ends the same. Heather beats Liming with a suitcase as they struggle in the cockpit. Cameron rams his rocket into the front of the blimp, causing it to crash towards the ground. Liming jumps out and grabs the $1 million briefcase, but Chris, using his jetpack, takes it back. Cameron falls off the front of the blimp towards imminent death, but Zoe saves him using her newly tamed goats. After the challenge, Dawn meets with Zoe, saying she heard about her becoming a goat whisperer, and she's proud because it really suits her. Zoe says, "Thanks, I think." Dawn mentions that her and Liming were thinking about voting Joe, and Zoe cuts her off, saying she's in. Dawn smiles a little mischievously, saying good, and walks away. Cameron walks into Zoe a bit after, and Zoe congratulates him on his win. Cameron takes the compliment and tells her they have to talk. He mentions voting out Liming, and Zoe is shocked, asking how he could be willing to save Joe after what she did, reminding him that Mike was his friend too. Cameron says Mike was, but Liming almost won today and would have won yesterday despite falling behind if there was the extra landmark. Cameron says they can't risk letting him stay and they can eliminate Joe another day. Zoe has a confessional sighing, saying if Cameron, even having the same strong connection to Mike that she did, wants to still work with Joe, then it must be the smart move. Zoe groans about how much harder this vote just got. And with that, the vote is pretty obvious for everyone else. Cameron and Joe are voting Liming, Liming and Dawn are voting Joe. The question mark here is Zoe. And as much as she doesn't like Joe, Zoe is very close to Cameron, and because he can understand her pain of losing Mike like that and still wants to work with Joe, Zoe would understand that it must be the smart move and vote for Liming, causing a 3-2 vote. Chris hands out the marshmallows and Dawn looks very smug, as does Joe. When Chris pauses on the last marshmallow between Liming and Joe, but eventually gives the last one to Joe. Dawn gasps, asking how this could, but Zoe interrupts with a meek sorry. Dawn realizes what happened with her frozen look, as Joe tells her you still have a lot to learn, princess, and eats Dawn's marshmallow. Liming sighs in his seat, reciting to himself that he only had 2 challenge wins, and that was the team portion. Chris tells Liming it's okay because he likes the losers more anyways, and invites Liming to his exit chariot, and chuckles. Liming sits in the cannon pole when Dawn quickly runs up to him. Dawn pulls out a gold medal she found in the junkyard. Liming reads the inscription on the back, and it says first place for regional figure skate championship, Mr. Hackett. Chris eyes down Chef, while Chef just whistles. Dawn apologizes she couldn't find anything more topical, but she just wants him to know that he's always a winner in her eyes. Liming smiles at it and places it over his neck, saying thanks scary girl. Dawn smiles back and says they are on first name basis by now, and he can just call her girl. Liming responds, thanks Dawn, but gets launched while saying Dawn, making it elongated. The episode starts with Cameron comfortably stretching out her sleeping bag. He has a confessional enjoying the male side of the cabin to himself, saying it feels like he has a personal bubble space again. Although he's worrying about what the girls are talking about right now, he knows they can't be close after last night, but even despite living most of his life in a bubble, he's overheard his mom watching Desperate Housewives sometimes, and he's heard of girl code and girl cliques. Cameron snaps sassily to accentuate his point. He continues saying girls seem to have a natural gravitation towards each other, and he hopes they aren't creating a girls' alliance right now against them. The camera goes into the girls' cabin, showing Joe slowly waking up, but becomes quickly startled noticing Dawn staring at her. Joe groggily asks, "What are you doing, freak show?" Dawn answers that she was just lost in thought, thinking about how bad her bloodline failed to make such a nasty human. Joe gets up stretching, saying, "Funny, I was wondering the same thing about you. Your tiny frame and weak physique, it's a miracle that evolution allowed you to survive past guinea pigs." Joe leaves the cabin. Zoe, sleeping in the bunk above Dawn, sticks her head over the edge, facing Dawn upside down, asking if they can talk. Dawn says, "You can talk, but I have nothing to say to you." Zoe says that's understandable, while jumping down and sitting next to Dawn. Zoe apologizes for voting out Liming behind her back, but she was just playing the game. Dawn corrects her, saying you are playing Joe's game. Dawn makes an attack on Zoe's character, saying there's only one reason she did that, and Dawn already knows it. She's a people pleaser. Zoe, insulted, tells Dawn that she's being rude, and that isn't true at all. Dawn just asks if it was her initial plan to vote him out or if someone told her to. Zoe goes quiet as Dawn says exactly and stands up, saying she's gonna go get fresh air because her lies reek. Dawn has a confessional, feeling a little bad about what she said, but remembering how hurt she was last night, saying she thought yesterday she had 2 friends in this game. Today she has 0. Originally, while Chris was explaining the challenge, he walked into one of Scott's snares, making him out of commission for the day and giving Chef the go to do his challenge. Because Scott isn't here, Chris wouldn't walk into one of these snares, but I have no way of knowing what this challenge was before Chris went out of commission, so we're just gonna follow the same challenge and say Chris went on a mini vacation or something like that. Chef explaining the first part of the challenge to cook something leads to Joe having a confessional saying she's never really cooked before. It was always too dollhousey for her. I'm not really sure what Joe or Dawn would do in this challenge for their meal. Dawn would probably try to make a vegetarian meal since she wouldn't want to harm any living creatures. Don't really know how to be different from Zoe's. Maybe she'd try using flowers instead because she'd have nature knowledge to know which flowers are palatable. Unsure about that, but it doesn't really matter because of Cameron's baking mama experience anyway, so whatever she makes, she's not winning. And the same thing with Joe, but she would probably attempt to make a trail mix of sorts of mutant peanuts and seeds, and would try to cut edges by putting more exotic things in there to make her meal look more impressive, knowing DJ has to eat it, so she doesn't really care what she has to put in. But then Chef changes the challenge to everyone eating their own meal when DJ runs away, and without Scott switching out his and Cameron's meal, Cameron would win this part of the challenge and not be given a tracking collar. Chef describes the next part of the challenge and gives everyone a head start. Joe would catch up with Cameron once it starts, asking how her favorite Alliance member is doing. Cameron flatly says, "I'm your only Alliance member." Joe continues saying, "That's why you're my favorite," asking if he wants to travel with her. Joe has a confessional saying if they travel together, then when Chef tracks her down, all she has to do is outrun Cameron. This is basic herd mentality, I travel with the weakest herd so I can survive. Cameron smirks saying she can just run back to the cabins because without a tracker on himself, he has an easy path to the flag and will win this challenge very quickly. He runs ahead and Joe follows after him to see him hunched over already out of breath. Cameron asks if he made it and Joe replies he did if his goal was 10 feet ahead. Cameron sits on the ground admitting he can't make it and agrees to get the collar off of Joe if she gets him to the end. Joe agrees but asks how he'll get it off her since she already tried and before she can finish, Cameron touches her collar and shocks her. Joe is unamused but Cameron figures out it's using electromagnetic pulse and uses his watch to blah 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 nerd stuff make the collar come off. Joe is impressed by that saying she'll ditch it but Cameron eyeing the mutant raccoon says he has a better idea and Joe smirks back at him picking up on his idea, telling Cameron she's really starting to like him and she actually means it this time. Chef still hunts down Zoe and leads to her becoming Commando Zoe. This mostly happened due to losing Mike, which she still has in this world. I do think Scott had a part to play in it, antagonizing her and making her feel bad, but I think you could easily replace that with how much Joe has been antagonizing her in his place. Chef would follow Joe's tracker and like the original, Lyman and Cameron's, ends up shooting at the mutant cockroach and getting attacked by it. Dawn would be traveling through the woods when she feels a disturbance around the treetops. She stops walking and looking around, calling out to Zoe. Commander Zoe swings on a vine, swooping up Dawn as she pats down Dawn to check for anything valuable. Dawn asks what she's doing, and Zoe asks the same thing to her, saying with her tracker on her neck, she shouldn't be traveling out in the open so casually. Dawn feels Zoe's aura and feels her pain and intensity. She asks Zoe what happened to her, and Zoe corrects her, saying she's Commando Zoe now. Dawn has a confessional, confused, repeating, Commando, maybe I shouldn't have let her touch me, she says while wiping herself down. Joe and Cameron are running together while Cameron becomes completely winded. Joe tells him to keep moving it, and Cameron says he can't move his anything. She must carry him and fulfill her promise. Joe thinks about it and says nah, while continuing, but Cameron hops onto her back, like he did with Liming. Dawn and Commando Zoe see the flag, but Zoe quickly detects the sound of Chef's buggy and jumps behind a tree. Dawn feels a pasta ball launch past her head as Chef spots her and runs forward, and she runs forward trying to dodge the shots. She makes a large leap of a dodge, which succeeds but also makes her trip as Chef walks towards her. Just as he's about to take a shot, Commander Zoe drops in behind Dawn and shoots an arrow at her trap, making a boulder swing towards Chef. Dawn, exacerbated, asks if she just used Dawn as bait. Commander Zoe sarcastically says, "What, do you want a kiss on the cheek? You're fine." Dawn has a confessional worried about Zoe's behavior, saying this is all very unlike her, and Dawn worries that she's suffering from being in this game so long. Joe runs past both of them towards the flag. In the original, Liming noticed that the run was a little harder than usual because of Cameron's added weight, so Joe, not being as strong as Liming, would notice the weight even more, and being smarter would know that Cameron is on her back. If you want to say that Joe wouldn't notice this, then I still don't see her doing the cocky victory dance that Liming did, because she knows she's in a lot of danger, and isn't that arrogant. Well, she is arrogant, but not to that level. So either way this next sequence of events would play out, when she gets near the flag, Cameron trips Joe and tries to reach for the flag himself. He gets pretty close, but Joe is able to grab at his ankle herself, and climbing over him touches the flag while stepping on his back, winning invincibility. After the challenge, Dawn would talk with Cameron and Joe about Commando Zoe, saying Dawn is worried about her and thinks they should eliminate her so she can leave the game because it's messing with her psyche. Cameron and Joe look at each other as the camera cuts to the elimination ceremony. In a 3-2-1 vote, Dawn is eliminated. Joe has a confessional saying maybe Dawn had a point with this new Zoe, but Joe can't lie, she admires Zoe for finally becoming cool. She even likes the new Commando idea and says it should be a natural coming of age thing for any competent woman. Zoe and Cameron obviously weren't ever going to vote each other, and because Joe has immunity, Dawn was the only option. So yeah, Dawn gets eliminated here. Dawn is bummed about getting eliminated, but as Commander Zoe leans over to her, asking if that pleased her person, referencing the people pleaser comment earlier, Dawn places a hand on Zoe's shoulder, saying she hopes she'll find herself soon. The episode begins roughly the same as the original. Instead of Cameron being afraid of Liming, he's afraid of Joe from a practical sense about her winning the challenge yesterday and thinking she might win out. Commander Zoe tells him to get a grip and they'll work together to beat her today, and they end up making the friendship finale pact. Joe hears their deal from the door and the loud scream from Cameron with Zoe's harsh high five. Joe has a confessional saying she knows that girly scream from anywhere, that's Cameron's hand being hurt in any form of partnership involving your hand. She realizes the other two have turned against her, but is fine with it, saying Cameron outlived his usefulness anyways. Commando Zoe worries her though, and she'll have to be on her A game today, or better idea, make sure those two are on their F game. Chris explains the challenge with it basically going the same as it did with the Cameron and Zoe scenes. After Joe makes a rude comment to Cameron, Commander Zoe gets in her face, making Joe smile. Zoe asks what she's smiling about, and Joe just says she really likes this new energy from her, and asks if she really wants to be carrying Cameron around to the end. It's such a waste of her newfound power. Already attempting to plant seeds of doubt. The challenge starts, and like the original, Joe runs ahead, keeping her final piece of the map away from Cameron and Zoe. Joe, unlike Lightning, however, whose plan was to, quote, look around the forest for a big X, because his map piece was the last piece and it had a big X to mark the end, so he thought there was just a big X around. The writers got really lazy writing a dumb character. Joe obviously wouldn't be that dumb and instead have the idea to run ahead to keep her pace away from Cameron and Zoe, but then jump into nearby cover to let them pass her so she can follow them from behind and follow their pieces of the map, and then use hers by herself to get to the end. This plan gets messed up as the same massive fly and fire plant that attack Liming attack Joe. This leads to the same scene of Zoe seeing Joe's piece fall on the ground while she's fighting the fly, and Zoe leaping ahead to take it while saying it's the final piece she needs. Cameron walks ahead asking for clarification on the final piece we need, and the massive fly distracts Cameron with bold romantic advances. Zoe ends up flailing and almost falling into a quickly released toxic waste hole, to which Joe takes the opportunity to take all the pieces of the map and runs ahead. And also, unlike Liming, Joe would be able to stick the 3 pieces of the map in the correct order because she's not 5 and gets to Larry first. She walks over the stepping stones, and like it was for Zoe, one of them is the mutant turtle, which punches Joe far back into a tree, taking her momentarily out of the challenge. Cameron and Zoe, using Cameron's nerd knowledge about bugs or something, finds out where they have to go and arrives shortly after Joe is attacked by the turtle. Cameron notices the type of plant Larry is and knows the flower is most likely a sensor for her to clamp down on when something touches it. This gives Zoe the same idea to dingle Cameron over the flower for Vine, and Joe, like Liming, swings in on a vine herself and takes the flower and gets the lead. Zoe and Cameron continue to bicker, but make up a bit when Liming turns into a big monster plant, and Commando Zoe has a confessional noting that she is starting to say me instead of we with Cameron a bit too much. And the end of this challenge is essentially the same. Joe gets overtaken by Larry, and Zoe takes the flower from Joe, making Larry lose interest in Joe. Zoe throws the flower to Cameron, but when Commando Zoe gets the lead, he gets hesitant about throwing it back because of how much he's alluded to being in this for herself, getting Cameron chomped by Larry, at which point Zoe reverts back to herself and jumps in to save Cameron, as Joe grabs the flower from the ground and wins the challenge. For the elimination that Joe gets to decide who goes to the finale with, she would start off by saying she wants to go to the end with someone as deserving as her, a strong, competent player. Cameron, hearing this, jumps in and has his speech about how he came to this game a boy in a bubble, but he's leaving a man in a bubble, and takes his elimination in stride, because obviously he thinks Joe is talking about Zoe when he says a competent player. But Joe says he should let her finish, because she's going to take the only other person to have won an individual challenge this season, Cameron. Clearly Joe would do this because she knows he'll be easier to be at the end. In addition, I could also see her being a bit disappointed that Zoe reverted back from her commando form, which Joe rather enjoyed. The finale episode begins with Joe and Cameron walking back to the cabins from last night's elimination. Cameron feels bad for Zoe, thinking she was much more deserving, but Joe butters him up, saying he deserved to be here just as much, and he has a great role to play in making her look amazing tomorrow, when she effortlessly defeats him. Cameron points out he has a chance if the finale has intellectual components, and Joe laughs, calling that adorable, but finales are always physical. He should just consider surrendering tomorrow before she has to hurt him too badly. Joe has a confessional saying, as weird as it is to say, she's kinda proud of the kid, but that doesn't mean she's letting up yet. She came here to win, and if that means putting Cameron in a full body cast, then you won't see her crying. Joe adds that taking Cameron to the end has some other perks too, like now she has the female cabin side all to herself, so she can prepare for this battle tomorrow by working out like the Romans did, in the nude. Cameron has a confessional similar to the original where he's terrified about facing Joe one-on-one. He does have some confidence about making it this far though, and thinking about the times that Joe needed his help, so if the finale can remotely play to his strengths and not hers, then he's got this. Chris would pull out a TV to let the finalists talk to a loved one for 30 seconds. Cameron's would be the same, talking to his mom, and his mom revealing that she can't afford any more air for his bubble if he loses. I don't really have any good idea for Joe's family life, as I'm pretty sure she never even mentions her family, and I have no idea how similar they are to her. I've mentioned this before in my videos that finales become more rewrites to me so I can just conclude the story in a satisfying way, so I'm going to take complete creative liberty here and say that Joe's sister called. Does she have a sister? Whatever, that's what I'm going with. Joe's older sister calls from a gym, and Joe is excited to see her. Joe's sister says she missed her too, calling her by the nickname Sloppy Joe. Cameron inquiries about that nickname, and Joe's sister answers saying it's a nickname she has around the kickboxing gym for leaving her opponents looking less pretty. Joe's sister notices Cameron and instantly starts laughing at Joe's competition, telling her sister she's played this well, and she shouldn't scar him too badly. Cameron gulps as the sister's voice call ends. Joe makes the promise to her sister, telling Cameron her offer is still open from last night, to just give her an easy win and she won't hurt him. Cameron remains defiant, saying he won't let her scare him, and she's scared of her superior mental prowess. Joe scoffs and tells him to revise his will. Joe, as a confessional, actually somewhat agreeing since she's seen the amazing mental feats he's done, and she's smart enough to not underestimate him. But with the more terror bouncing around in his head, the less mental threat he poses. Chris takes the finalists to the arena and shows the cast in the peanut gallery that will cheer them on. Originally, Chris forced the original teams of each finalist to only cheer for their finalist, like Maggots could only cheer for Cameron and the Rats could only cheer for Liming. I don't really think this would still happen anymore since both are original Maggots. I guess in theory it still could because Joe switched onto the Rats, but only like 2 of the Rats members ever really met Joe. Also, this was just a really weird and contrived thing to me that the teams could only cheer for a select person, and they didn't even really play a part in the finale, so like I said earlier, I prefer treating finales like rewrites, and I would probably just scrap this entire idea. The creation of the battle armors goes basically the same, with Joe making similar hardened sort of wasteland battle armor like Liming, and I could also see her wiping mud over her eyelids to make her look like war paint. And maybe rip off her sleeves and tie one around her head like a headband to maybe match the headband that her sister wears to the gym. Chris ends the armor creating section, and Joe is unthreatened by Cameron, seeing him with just a suitcase. She says, oh well, she was excited to crush him to a pulp, but he must be taking her offer of running home to his mama. Cameron says, no, that's your job, while kicking the suitcase and getting into his robot suit. This end fight goes pretty similar to the original, as surprisingly enough, Liming plays his final fight very well and very similar to how I think Joe would go about it, letting the mutant creatures soften up Cam, and scolding him whenever he tries to save the cast from the release of all the mutant creatures, also finding opportune times to strike him to weaken him. You could call me lazy, but I also think the end result would play out the same of Cameron using the last of his energy to turn Joe into a giant magnet, and get her shocked by Liming and have her hair turn white. Then the alternate winning endings are just based on who falls over first and who falls onto the other. Cameron's winning ending remains the same, with him feeling good about not needing the bubble anymore after beating Joe, and he says he will spend $1 million on the cast. The only exception is when Joe gets excited about getting her own gym. Cameron pats her on the back and says you won't get enough for that, sport. Joe's face turns annoyed as she mutters a sarcastic, great. In Joe's winning ending, Cameron still has a conversation with Mike where he's proud of himself for not sustaining any great injuries and not needing his bubble anymore. Joe hops on the boat and tells Cameron he did well, sticking her hand out for a handshake. Cameron accepts it and asks what she will do with the money, thinking she'll probably get her hair redyed. Joe says she actually likes it like this and it looks good. The cast goes silent as Joe asks for confirmation, but doesn't get any. And there we go, that was What If Dawn Found the Real Invincibility statue. I actually think this one didn't come out half bad. Like I said at the beginning of this What If, I wasn't really too invested in this because I think the idea is still kind of contrived. But I think this What If touched on a lot of interesting things that normally wouldn't happen. Like I really enjoyed how Brick kind of falls into this antagonistic role of being rude to Dawn, but it's still matching like his moral compass because he's not just doing it to be a dick, he's doing it for an actual reason that really matches his character. Even though he got eliminated in the same spot, in fact most people in this What If got eliminated in similar spots, I still think it was a very interesting dynamic between Dawn and Brick. I also enjoy how Dawn became a bit more rude and self-assured instead of being her nice, dainty self, and it was also for a really good reason because I'll admit, sometimes I have an issue of like progressing or giving characters growth when there's not really a ton of merit for it, and I feel like Dawn was kind of like that in my last What If, where she became really self-assured and defeating Scott when there really wasn't a ton of reason for her to do it. But in this What If, it makes a lot of sense for her to become more confident in herself because everybody's constantly giving her grievances for, stealing their stuff, and she becomes tired of being so nice when everybody's treating her so terrible, so her becoming more rude to people that treat her poorly makes sense. I really enjoyed writing for Dawn when she's insulting people because her aura reading allows her to hit people really close to home, so she can actually come with very good insults when she's trying to be mean. I don't really know how I feel about Joe becoming like the main antagonist. I don't really feel like she was the main antagonist of the season. I lean more so to saying the season didn't really have one, but even if you still want to call her the main antagonist, I think Joe differentiates from a lot of other antagonists in a fun way, where she's not really like super strategic or bitchy. She kind of just like has fun doing her own thing. Like she isn't mean for the sake of being mean. She's pretty relaxed and still has her one-liners, which surprisingly enough is a pretty interesting dynamic for a villain that we haven't seen yet in the show. I love the dynamic between Joe and Cameron in the merge, as it was something that kind of got touched on in Joe's elimination episode, but I liked expanding it and seeing them in the finale where Joe kind of respects Cameron and Cameron has more reason to have this growth. I thought was really fun. I've never really got the chance to mention this because Joe hasn't done that well in both of my previous Revenge of the Island What Ifs, but Joe is actually like one of my favorite characters of this season, and it was really fun for me to work with her character in a finally substantial way. And yeah, with all that being said, bye.